And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Simmonds. I was the United Kingdom Minister for Africa, and subsequently I've been promoted to the Chairman of the Advisory Board of Invest Africa. So it's a real pleasure to see you all here this morning. This is a very optimistic and positive time for the African continent. I'm going to allow my very distinguished panellists to introduce themselves briefly in a moment. But there's some very interesting recent developments. The signatures of 44 African countries in Kigali for a free trade area, even though interestingly only 27 signed the agreement for free movement of people. The political landscape is changing in a positive way as well, with new leaderships in Angola, South Africa, Zimbabwe and Ethiopia, perhaps most recently, all creating an atmosphere where the investment community, both in Africa but also outside Africa, is really starting to look and focus on where the best places to invest their both equity and debt are. We've got a lot to cover in the hour that we've been allocated, both in terms from the experience of the panellists. So I'm going to ask, perhaps Sanjeev, would you be kind to introduce yourself, and then keep, please, the introductions brief, name, a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get into the detail.
Okay, so good morning, everybody. I work with Africa Finance Corporation. I'm a member of the board of directors and run their financial services business. For those of you who believe that Africa has a few secrets, I think AFC is one of the best kept ones, right? Because we are a multilateral DFI, run out of Lagos, Nigeria, been in existence for 10 years. I've invested close to $20 billion across 28 odd countries in Africa, including North Africa. We are rated A3. So that makes us the second best rated institution after the African Development Bank. The question that I'm very often asked, why haven't you invested more? And there are some very good reasons why we haven't, which we'll probably discuss as we go along. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kuseni Dlamini. I'm the chairman of Massmart Walmart. We are in 13 African countries. We've got 420 stores across Africa. We employ about 50,000 colleagues across the continent. We believe in the diversification of the African economic base. We believe that retail has got an important catalytic role to play in that. We are very excited with the prospects of continuing to play a role in the modernization of the retail industry across Africa.
My name is Christopher Mark. I am responsible for emerging markets at MUFG, which is Japan's largest institution. I think as many of you know, I've been a banker in and out of Africa for a long time, but equally on the public sector side, having worked at the African Development Bank, for the World Bank, and for the IMF, all in Africa. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Richard Morgan. I'm head of government relations at Anglo. As you probably know, global mining company, but jointly listed in London and in Johannesburg. Probably 30–40% of our operations, including that of our partner De Beers, is in southern Africa still, so a range of platinum, diamonds, iron ore, and coal still.
Morning, my name is Zemedeneh Negatu. I'm the chairman of a US-based investment firm called Fairfax Africa Fund, not to confuse with the Fairfax of Canada. We invest in sub-Saharan Africa. We raise money deal by deal. We have 5 sectors that we focus on: manufacturing, agro, infrastructure, and then resource on an opportunist basis, and then the tourism sector. We're very happy to be here. I'm just a rounding error on the balance sheet of all the companies that are listed here, but I think we're much more nimble. I'm an ex-Ernst & Young managing partner, now on the entrepreneurial side.
Battle lines are drawn now.
Thank you all very much. Kuseni, can I start with you? You're running or chairing 2 very large African corporates, one in the retail sector, one in the pharmaceutical sector as well. Perhaps you could just say a little bit about the opportunities that you see African corporates having, but particularly in the context of what Alain was saying a moment ago about the lack potentially of corporate bonds in Africa, and the potential growth across Africa, therefore making African corporates playing a much bigger role in the global economy.
Thank you very much, Mark. I think African corporates have a huge role to play, and there's a massive potential to grow their operations across the continent and develop dominant market shares, not just in Africa, but beyond Africa. As Massmart, we really are focused on growing our scale across Africa and making sure that our value chain is also open to other players across other sectors, such as manufacturing. We're the most diversified retailer on the African continent. We move building supplies, we move DIY products. We are in general merchandise, with the largest general merchandise retailer, with the largest wholesaler on the continent. And we are able to establish linkages with manufacturers in different industries by opening up our shelves for them. We set up a supplier development fund to assist manufacturers in South Africa, for example. Some of them are not just supplying us in South Africa and Africa. We have opened the global Walmart supply chain to them. They're able to export across the world. I believe that if more corporates, not just us, can be able to use their value chains and their supply chains to be able to create opportunities for other African players, we can really develop global giants, just like you see in countries such as Japan, countries such as Germany, and elsewhere in the world. On the pharmaceutical side, I'm chairman of Aspen Pharmacare. We've got 26 manufacturing plants across the world. We've got 4 in South Africa. We've got a representation in a number of countries. We also have proven through Aspen that African companies can actually be dominant and be able to lead, not just in their home countries, but globally. We've got factories in Germany, in France, in the Netherlands. We've got only 4 factories in South Africa, and all those factories are run and led by management teams based in South Africa, based in Durban, where our headquarters is. Aspen was founded in a 4-bedroom house in the late 1990s in South Africa. Today, it's got a market cap of over $10 billion US. We are in over 50 countries in the world, developed countries and developing countries. But having said that, as they say, one swallow doesn't make a summer. There is still a conspicuous underrepresentation of African corporates in the FTSE 100, Fortune 100, Fortune 500. And if you look at Africa and compare Africa to other continents, our underrepresentation in the global league of nations or corporate global leagues is very conspicuous. And I believe that if Africa is to really play a meaningful role in the global economy, which is our topic today, we need to make sure that we create an ecosystem that makes African corporates to think big, think global, and develop capacities on a global scale and be able to be globally competitive, because that's how the world economy is. There is no guarantee for success. You've got to embrace best practice. You've got to be ahead of your game. You've got to understand what your competitors are doing and stay ahead of them.
Thank you. Clearly, there's a huge potential role to build on the success stories that you've just been articulating for African corporates. But also, Christopher, you're very heavily involved, particularly with bringing Japanese corporates and Japanese finance into Africa. And I think it'd be helpful you just to articulate something about the opportunities that you see from where you sit. I know you have a huge knowledge of the continent and all the 54 countries that make up the vast and complex continent that is Africa. Could you say a little bit about the challenges and opportunities that you're facing sitting in MUFG and the view from the Japanese perspective, particularly the private financing sector, which I think almost could be described as sort of the new kids on the block with a huge amount of excitement and potential capital coming into the continent?
Well, the Japanese, I think, as everyone in this room knows, have been slow. And there are about 750 Japanese corporations on the continent today, which is tiny compared to the 10,000-odd Chinese, of course. There's a big political imperative coming out of Japan to catch the Chinese. I think we can speak in these terms. But the corporations have been slow, global as they are, as dominant as they are in Southeast Asia, partially in Latin America. They have not engaged as directly, in part because they haven't been as competitive. And I don't mean only the trading houses that operate as EPC contractors, the engineering firms that are already present, but I mean real investment. 10 days ago, and this is changing, this is my one example, 10 days ago I finished a roadshow for 5 days with the government of Ghana in Tokyo. On that Friday the 13th, there was an investment seminar. 140 Japanese companies came to hear Ken Ofori-Atta, the Minister of Finance, and his delegation, talk about West Africa and talk about Ghana. It's interesting because the Japanese, I think, as people have a sense, heavily invested in South Africa, the scale, developed economies, a lot of automotive activity, relatively active in Kenya, East Africa is viewed as a relatively comfortable, friendly, familiar place, and activity in the automotive sector equally in Morocco. Very, very little in West Africa, almost nothing in French West Africa. That week, with Ghana in Tokyo, of course we talked to the engineering and trading firms as well, but equally agribusiness companies, conversations with some of the most high-tech investors in the country, conversations about how to bring to West Africa some of that technology they use in India and China for, this is not just electronic wallets, but even for the government to use some of the scanning technology to eliminate cash in the society, for improving tax collection, things that you would never imagine would find a home. But these were live discussions between the Minister of Finance and this Japanese investor that does this around the world. One last example that I think is really emblematic of African visibility and the willingness, even conservative Japanese corporations, to go into the continent. Take Toyota. Toyota, in addition to producing Land Cruisers, as you know, they do everything in Africa. They have a fertilizer plant in Kenya. They're building ports down in southwestern Africa. They are equally, and this is the point, they have bought a dominant shareholding in CFAO. And I think, as most of you know, it's the old French trading company that brings in a lot of the product and has for 100 years across West Africa. They are now Toyota. In addition, Toyota has moved its African headquarters to Paris. It's the most unlikely thing possible, but it's because of their participation now in CFAO. So in addition to moving product and Land Cruisers, of course, they're building things like retail commercial centers in Abidjan, which they partner now, because they're partially more French, with people like Carrefour. So I'll stop there, but you see it's interesting to see how even the Japanese, and even in their heavy conservative traditional industrial way, are finding new entry points onto the continent.
Thank you. Richard, one of the traditional roles that Africa has played in the global economy is, of course, the export of extractives. And whilst we all want to see economic diversification, job creation across the African continent, extractives are going to play an important role in the next period of African economic history. Could you just say a little bit about the importance of extractives, and particularly in the context of two things? One, making sure that African countries benefit from extractive that are exported, not just globally, but within the continent itself. And also perhaps say a little bit about how there is a new wave of extractive industries that is going to feed some of the technology that is coming down the track, that or is indeed already here.
No, happily. Yeah, beneficiation is the word we are often addressing as large extractive companies in Africa, because, of course, people don't want to see the raw materials just go straight to port and out. There are three things I want to say quite quickly on that. One is that governments need to be, yes, ambitious, but be also realistic. We take Anglo-American in South Africa, which of course was a big diversified company, can't now be as a global listed miner. We can't do everything, but we have to sort of think as creatively as we can. But the iron ore, for example, we were encouraged, to put politely, to sell cheaply to the South African steel-making company, so that South African steel could stand a chance against the Chinese manufacturers. That, in that particular time and context, was not going to be that realistic. Whereas other things, for example, clearly I mentioned diamonds and platinum. I mean, iron ore is common around the world, steel making in Korea and Japan and China, very, very established and competitive, had scale. Diamonds and platinum, very much a dominant area in South Africa for the production of both. And we, as the major supplier of both, are quite a good partner then to talk to. You can have that sort of conversation so that platinum comes out of the ground very, very unconcentrated. There's a lot of refining and smelting to be done. That processing for us happens in South Africa, and in fact, interestingly, in Zimbabwe, we're building a smelter. Even though our platinum mine in Zimbabwe is not that large, it's a sort of gesture of confidence that you can actually do some of that processing in country, because we know that's important to the country concerned. So that can be part of that dialogue. So I think governments have to, yes, have that dialogue, be realistic, but have some sense of context on what's going to work. Companies, I think, have to think that, say, mining is getting more technologically advanced, and we have to then think about how we can maybe not create jobs directly on the mine, but that if we can use less water in our processing, can we divert that water and have that used for agricultural products? So I think partnership with companies and creating economic activity and jobs, if not necessarily on the mine, then off the mine. And we've set ourselves ambitious targets in our new sustainability strategy just to do that, so that your many jobs off the mines, on the mine. Again, that needs a good conversation with government. And finally, on your point on technology, yes, platinum, very interesting new potential use in hydrogen fuel cells. We would like all cities in the world to be driving around in hydrogen fuel cell cars rather than petrol cars. So that there is a potential conversation there, but obviously the other area is that if electric cars are going to take the edge, then you've got the whole interest in battery technology, cobalt from the DRC, etc. So I think there is definitely a conversation to be had, and if you can work that well, then there is manufacturing opportunities to be had as well, but clearly be context specific.
Thank you. Zem, you're running a fund based out of US, investing, focused on Africa.
Right.
I know you have significant knowledge of Ethiopia.
Right.
And the Chinese involved in Ethiopia. China has cropped up in every single remarks that have been made so far. I think it'd be very interesting to get your perspective on the difference that you see between the attitude of China and the attitude of the United States to investing in Africa.
Well, thank you very much. It's odd for me as an American to promote China in Africa, but I'm going to try to put that in perspective here. As you said, I'm a hyphenated American, originally from Ethiopia, so I have a unique perspective on what's going on in Ethiopia. And you've seen me speak in the past where I've been a very big fan. I'm bullish on Africa, so please put that in context as I speak. I've been very, very aggressively promoting this notion called the developmental state. It doesn't mean that we exclude the private sector from Africa's transformation, but the reality is, I mean, look at the new IMF data that just came out. The anchor economies of Africa, South Africa is growing at 1.5%. Nigeria is growing at 2.1%. In fact, the one that is an outlier, which is the best performing economy in Africa, according to the IMF, is Ethiopia. And Ethiopia has adapted the developmental state model, which is very similar to how the Asians got to be wealthy in a span of 50 years. So I think sometimes if we strip out the emotion about, the state getting involved in running economies in Africa, the fact of the matter is, as a proud African, I have to say the last 50, 55 years in Africa, to a certain extent, has been disappointing. So I don't think it's unrealistic for us as Africans to start thinking of a model that we've seen deliver results in our lifetime. Certainly in my lifetime, I have a lot of gray hair, so I think I've seen them go from dirt poor to, like China, the second largest economy in Africa. So in the case of Ethiopia, for example, I know the Chinese get a lot of bad rap that they're there to exploit Africa, but at least certainly where I'm based, where my office is, not far from my office are huge industrial parks. In fact, one of the industrial parks is the largest in Africa, is based right there, which makes Calvin Klein suits, Tommy Hilfiger t-shirts, Ivanka Trump shoes for export. I know some of you don't buy that shoes, but it is now made in Ethiopia by Chinese companies for export to the United States. This is the opportunity that we have now in Africa for the migration to industrialization. Nothing wrong with the Western model. I mean, Walmart is a client of my ex-firm, and of course with the Japanese banks and others, we work. So there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's time to rethink how we develop. I invest in countries that are high performing. And I look for these kinds of trends. Do they have it right? It doesn't mean. I use the data. When people say, well, we don't want governments involved in running African economies, well, I say 30 years ago, 70% of jobs created in China were the Chinese state. Today, 70% of jobs are created by the Chinese private sector. So the developmental state model needs to think along those lines, as opposed to saying, are we going to phase out? Are we going to marginalize the likes of Walmart and other companies? No, that's not the case. But to accelerate, I don't see why South Africa cannot grow by 7%. There's no reason why Nigeria is not growing by 8 to 10%. I don't think it's an accident that the fastest growing economy for the last 12 years in Africa has been Ethiopia, at 10.5%. The other closest thing we have, and these are real examples, is Rwanda, which also has adopted the developmental state, where the state has an active role. So this is why I think we need to rethink how we develop in Africa. And for investors like that, it gives us confidence when the state has the capacity to give us the vision, but also to deliver. Not to discount the challenges, not to cut and paste what the Chinese have done, but at least to look at it more carefully, because I see a lot of misallocation of resources right now, without naming names in Africa, countries where the government is an afterthought, where the private deals are done, and the meager resources a particular country has not been deployed appropriately, and it makes it difficult for investors like us and others to operate effectively. So I think this is the model that I've been promoting because it is delivered in Asia.
Thank you. The developmental state, I think, is going to be an ever-increasing part of the African growth story. I remember President Museveni saying to me that he had decided he wanted a developmental state structure in Uganda because, evidenced by his South Korean conversations, that he'd only, he told me, met one South Korean economic migrant whose name was Ban Ki-moon. Sanjeev, one of the, we sort of take that theme, the developmental state theme, one of the key areas to facilitate greater intra-African trade and therefore make Africa a bigger and more important part of the global economy is, of course, the development of infrastructure as an enabler. Do you want to say a little bit about your views on that and the work of the AFC in trying to facilitate infrastructure, and perhaps not just the traditional infrastructure, important though it is in terms of roads, ports, but also the connectivity in terms of mobile banking, etc., that also is becoming an increasingly important part of infrastructure in Africa?
Yeah, so as I said in my introduction, that we have successfully managed to invest and develop in infrastructure projects across what is now 30 countries, including, as I said, Arab Africa. And I think we can all safely agree that infrastructure, having infrastructure or not having infrastructure, is not an option. It's a must. And it's a must because if you are not going to develop infrastructure, none of these esteemed people around this podium will have a business to run, right? Because if you're not going to have infrastructure which will make countries come closer, which will make people come closer, which will allow beneficiation to happen, which will allow Massmart to sell its products, the economic multiplier and the gains will not arise. From our point of view, the biggest and the remaining big problem, and that problem is not going to go away, which is where Zem's point around being a development state is an interesting one, is that one of the biggest ironies, Mark, today we see in Africa is the amount of money that's been raised for investing in Africa is a fraction of what probably Africa requires. But, ironically, it's a multiple of what Africa has been able to absorb. I mean, us is a case in point, that we are an A3 rated institution. We've done 2 Eurobond issuances. First time we went to the market, we had an order book for $3 billion. We only took 750. Next time, we had an order book of 2.8. We only took 500, right? Now, why is that? The reason for that is that governments, policymakers, promoters of infrastructure projects are not looking at the key issues that makes a project bankable. And I purposely use the word bankable because that encompasses the whole set of factors that makes investors say, I'll invest in this project. One quick example, one of the most successful projects we ever did in Africa was a $900 million power project in Ghana. When it's completed, it will deliver 25% of that country's power alone. You know how long it took us from the time it was conceived to the time we actually finally closed it? 7.5 years. So therefore, the point I'm trying to make is for the audience here and for generally people around, yes, there is opportunities to invest in infrastructure in Africa, but you've got to be very patient. You've got to be able to work with the policymakers. You've got to hold their hands because there is this issue about not enough capital in terms of intellectual capital and competency that doesn't exist in a lot of the government departments. And which is where I'll make one comment on Zem's point of view. I mean, I always knew that Zim was a closet socialist, even though he lives in America and spouts capitalism, right? But infrastructure is a very good example where a development state actually can make such a big difference. If you'll allow me, I'll just tell you that we are advising and investing in Rwanda's second airport, Kigali, right? The airport called Bugesera. It's a $500 million project. In 6 months, we've reached a stage where we're probably going to do the financial close in another 2 months. That's a record by anybody's standards. And I can tell you, the reason that it's happened is because of what you said. That the Rwanda Air, the Ministry of Transport, the President's Office, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Trade, each one of them have a representation in that committee. We sit, we meet, we decide what needs to happen. Within a week, each of the respective departments and ministers come back with a decision. And that, I think, is the key to how we can actually solve this infrastructure puzzle in Africa.
Christopher.
Yeah, no, and it's I think carrying forward Sanjeev's point, and Zem's provided a framework for discussion, and I wouldn't conflate 3 things, which I think is what we're doing. Determined and clear political leadership at the top with a sense of mission, state ownership and state-directed economic activity, and a clear sense of norms and rules. In Rwanda, I would say we have clear and determined leadership and effective leadership, and a very clear sense of norms, because it's quite a diversified set of actors in Rwanda. They set it up, I'm not sure if I would compare it easily as a state developmental model. The Americans are there, the Japanese are there, everyone understands it's a place that works. That's not the same thing as having a very determined but relatively monolithic provider of capital for a set of relatively narrow, exciting industrial outcomes. I think there'll be limitations to that. And I think one of the interesting trends, and the colleague, the economist speaking earlier, talked about some of the public bond issuance, which continues to take place out of African sovereigns. I would argue the more interesting trend, and it's a reflection in part of the absence of infrastructure investment in Europe these days, has been some of the private and insurance money coming into the continent. Much publicized was Alliance's investment, for example, in the Africa Energy Fund, Emerging Africa Infrastructure Fund. But there are a number of other examples where people are looking to come onto the continent. That kind of money can only come into a very clear, well-regulated and articulated set of governance frameworks. And that's not everywhere. And so I think there are limitations to the dynamic, as happy as it has been in Ethiopia.
Can I be clear, though? These are not mutually exclusive events or approaches. I mean, there's room for the Japanese, there's room for the Americans, although I'm beginning to question the relevancy of the U.S. in Africa as we go along. I mean, I think I mentioned to you earlier, I saw the number that total U.S. export to Africa last year was $22 billion. I mean, that is, I was joking earlier about rounding errors. This is beyond rounding errors. I mean, this is just meaningless number. So we need to be careful. But it's not to suggest that a state that is activist, that is helping direct, that is helping bring in capital from China, doesn't mean that it doesn't have room for your bank or Massmart to operate, or any of the. So I just want to be very, very clear about it when we talk about the developmental state. It is also not a cut and paste of China, but also a portion that we learned from the Koreans, for example. I mean, even the Japanese, after 1945, what did they do? They built the Ministry of Industry and Trade, which was a very activist ministry in the Japanese model that helped. I just very briefly, you joked about the South Koreans. Not too long ago, I had breakfast with the then foreign minister of South Korea, and he was telling me, even though these chaebols, the Samsung, Daewoo, Hyundai, all these were private companies, as late as the late 60s and early 70s, some of the board meetings were actually held in the presidential palace in South Korea with the generals who are running South Korea. Mm. And look where South Korea, would we not want to be like South Korea today? I would say yes. Because these other models, again, I'm speaking not just in theory, but as an investor who's looking to deploy capital. And the people that we work with, and I'm sure all of you, are looking for high growth markets. The other model has delivered to a certain extent, but if African countries don't grow by 7% sustainably for at least 10% plus, poverty reduction, which is at the end of the day what we're trying to do, alleviation of poverty, is not going to happen. And that hasn't, I'm sorry, it hasn't happened by and large in Africa. It's been very disappointing. So this is, I want my colleagues here, and all of them, we just met, but the others I know, is not to suggest there's no room for the Japanese or the Koreans or the South Africans. There is.
The challenge, of course, is that the private sector likes to do business with other private sector actors. And with the exception of 4 or 5 countries in Africa, that is not possible. There has to be government buy-in. Of course, that, we all know that adds other layers of complexity into the conversations and the investment decisions. Yeah, Richard, do you want to come in?
Sorry, very quickly, just going to pick up on the governance point. It is, of course, critical if you're going to invest the sort of money that you need for a mine over the length of time you're going to, that you've got that rule of law in place. And that the question of parastatals is always two-edged, because if it gets too politicized, then you end up with an unhelpful context and an unlevel playing field, and you get pushed into trying to take decisions that aren't right. So I think it's an interesting balance. I think you do need to talk to government. You do need, and it's not enough for government just to be neutral and tolerant. They need to be proactive. It's been an interesting experience in South Africa, going from the last mining minister, Zwane, to the new one, Gwede Mantashe, who was a former unionist leader and sort of self-declared socialist, as it were, actually gives you a much better conversation than a kind of laissez-faire minister, perhaps, that one saw before. Because you need to have that social contract in place for that to work on a longer-term basis.
Kuseni, could I just ask you to comment on that, the importance of, in the African context, business-government relations and cooperation, both across the continent, but also to sell, if you like, or market the African corporates to the bigger global economy?
I think that's a fundamentally important issue that, unfortunately, has been overlooked over the last decades or so. I think Africa is lagging behind in terms of having a mutually reinforcing relationship between government and business. The relationship tends to be either too close and bordering on the corrupt or non-existent. I think going forward, it's really about partnerships, as Alain was saying earlier on. It's not also either it's a developmental state or the private sector. It's actually end-to-end. We have seen with the South African renewable energy independent power producer program, which is about $20 billion over the last 5 years, and there's a recent round that was signed of 27 new IPPs that were signed. And that process was run largely by the private sector through an independent power producer program office set up outside of the realm of government, but it was allowed to run independently without any influence from politicians, without any influence from bureaucrats, and that has been by far one of the most successful independent power producer program rollouts in the world. I think at the global level, African countries need to appreciate the importance of their private sectors. We need to have closer alignment, especially around issues around foreign policy. Mark, we come from that space, and the commercial strategies of major African corporates. When you look at other continents, you find that there's a level of alignment and a level of mutually reinforcing relationships that are there between foreign policy and also the commercial strategies of major African firms. We need African global champions in the corporate space, but they cannot come from the sky. They need to be harnessed. We need an ecosystem that is supportive, and we need relationships that are based on the national interest, based on the pursuit of poverty alleviation, reducing inequalities, and creating jobs for ordinary citizens, rather than relationships that are bordering on corruption.
Sanjeev.
Yeah, so, Mark, if I may just come in, I think, unfortunately, there is a certain, very high degree of sensitivity from an outsider's point of view when it comes to doing business in Africa, that somehow less government must be better. It's like a sweeping little policy that we don't want government to be anywhere near business. We want government to somehow govern without supporting business. because that's the only way progress will be made. And I think we have to be careful here, because words like state capture and tenderpreneurship, where tenders are a means to get to become a successful entrepreneur, are kind of cited as instances of everything that is wrong about the continent, right? The point I would like to make is that, and I don't think anybody is saying anything otherwise, is that business or growth or development or job creation or foreign direct investment is not going to happen without involving the government. The reality also is that, barring a few exceptions, the continent, out of the 54 countries that makes up the continent, probably 50 of them together, individually that is, are not big enough to attract significant investments and opportunities unless they get together. Now, why am I making that point? I'm making that point because governments have to work together, not only with the private sector, but with other governments, to get trade barriers removed, to get standardization around tariff structures, to make goods move easier, to make labor policies such. I'll give you an example where very often when we want to invest in a country, we can't get the work permit for the gentleman who's going to run that business for us. So that's where government has to come in. Why we were pleasantly surprised with the 2 projects that we've done in Rwanda was because these issues actually exist everywhere. But it's the pace at which government engages with the private sector to remove those obstacles. And that's what we want to see from government, that there is a central vision, a central leadership, and an ability to support the private sector in what it wants to do, not to remove government from it.
Richard, can I just say a little bit about specifically the extractive sector and the important role that business and government play in working together, both to ensure that there is a fair return on capital for the investor, but also that Africans themselves benefit, particularly in the areas where the extractives are being taken from. But also perhaps beyond that, and there are a number of African governments that are now talking about legislating to, if there's any refining or upstream to be done, it has to be done in country, not exported elsewhere. And I'm not going to mention, but there's some, you might be slightly surprised, some of these countries are the sort of Africa for beginners end, rather than perhaps more complicated places like CAR. But I think it would be helpful, Richard, for people to understand the importance of governments and where you see your sector going in that space.
Yeah, I alluded to it a bit earlier. There are certain examples where you are required to do as much refining and processing as you can in country. It has to be by a degree of negotiation as to what is viable. The smelter I talked about actually in Zimbabwe was long in the discussion because, of course, we have the full refining and smelting capacity for platinum in South Africa. But, of course, the Zimbabweans wanted it to happen in Zim, and we were saying, but do you have enough power, because smelting is quite power intensive in Zimbabwe, to do it? And so we got there, but you have to keep the conversation going to the extent that it makes sense for both parties. And that's really the key thing. The oft-quoted example, of course, is Botswana and diamonds, where we're now all about to move back, Anglo American and De Beers, back into the De Beers building around the corner from here in Charthouse Street, because all the diamonds now get sold in Botswana. So it no longer needs to be a fortress, it can be a modern open office space in London. So the selling of all the diamonds of the whole De Beers production line happens in Botswana. A fair amount of the cutting and polishing happens there, but that has to be negotiated because the real expertise globally for cutting and polishing is in Gujarat in India. Yeah. So still over 90% of the world's diamonds will get cut and polished there. And so you can't fight the context, but you can do things within the envelope of what is commercially sustainable. Yeah. And so so that with all the diamond sales happening in Botswana, De Beers will allow us to sell largely to the approved site holders. The approved site holders to be encouraged to get access to those rough diamonds will do a fair amount of cutting and polishing in Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. So, but that's not something you can prescribe. You can put numbers down, and at the moment it's sort of 15% of some of the sales in Botswana. But you have to make sure that'll work over time. And so those specifics, yes, you can see the tension there But yes, you have to come to an agreement. Otherwise, you just say, look, this is not going to work. And you just have to, and then it comes down to trust. You know, are you pulling a fast one on me? No, I'm not. It has to be how it goes.
Thank you. Christopher, then Sam. Christopher.
Yeah, just picking up on another dynamic, which is an extension of both that Richard and Sanjeev just talked about, which is the regional push by governments, by enlightened governments, to capture both greater inter-African trade and more interesting dynamics. Now, the Moroccans have been at this for quite some time. The king has very cleverly embraced all of French West Africa as the older brother, joined ECOWAS. All of this is familiar to people, but if you see it in government policy very cleverly, if you want to join the Casablanca International Financial Center, and we have looked at this, 40% of your revenue over the course of 5 years has to be outside of Morocco in West Africa in order to qualify for all of the tax benefits and the assistance for getting in. So it's part of the deal for getting into Morocco. It's very interesting, very challenging in Tokyo because suddenly they have to look ahead to a group of countries they've never heard of in addition to Morocco. Senegal is starting a new airline after several failures. Why is that? Of course, to try to beat Air France from their most luxurious routes up to Paris, but equally, all of that old Air Afrique kit and training material, some of it is still there. So they're trying to build up again and capture the regional dynamic. Last point, in Ghana, what was the big slogan in Tokyo? Taking advantage, I will say, of some of Nigeria's distractions. Ghana is the West African hub. It's the Anglophone hub, safe, democratic, easy to deal with. Here we are, young government, take us on. So these are very interesting new pitches.
Very quickly, with all due respect to my colleagues in the natural resource space, and this argument that we in Africa cannot add value and export has been there for 50, 60 years. It's being presented as if it's rocket science or brain surgery. I'll give you a very quick example. We're currently, in my fund, we're currently looking to build a refinery for East Africa. It's a $4 billion deal. And when I started doing the road shows, and everybody told me this is crazy. Even in Nigeria, they don't have big refineries, although there is one under construction. And I kept asking why. Obviously, I'm basing it in a country that doesn't have oil, but that was irrelevant because I went and looked at South Korea. I went and looked at Japan. Yeah. They don't produce a single barrel of oil, and some of the world's largest refineries are in South Korea and Japan. Yeah. So this argument, I was born in a country that produces, I'm biased, the best coffee in the world, Ethiopian coffee, right? Right in front of my house in D.C. is a Starbucks. They sell Ethiopian coffee at $17.50 a pound. It left Ethiopia at $2. This is what we've been arguing in Africa since independence, okay? And that's what I am talking about. When we talk about the role of Africa in the global economy, unless we address this. So I'm actually looking at this as an opportunity. In fact, I was just telling one of my colleagues here, we're signing a deal this week with some very big investors to convert the coffee into value-added, it could be Nescafe or Folgers or Maxwell House. If we don't do that, the role of Africa in the global economy will continue to be marginal at best. And that's all I'm talking about.
Thank you. Kuseni, do you want to come in?
Just wanted to come in on the issue of intra-regional trade. I think that's another area of opportunity. Last month, I attended the signing of the Continental Free Trade Area in Kigali, Rwanda. I was very impressed to see 44 heads of states signing up to the Continental Free Trade Area commitment, and as Mark said earlier on, only 27 signed up to the free movement of people. When you look at Africa in a global context, only 16% of African trade is intra-regional. That is by far the lowest in the whole world. If you look at Europe, it's over 50%. Asia is over 50%. Latin America is also over around 40% or so. I think there is more opportunity now with the signing of the Continental Free Trade Area and other regional economic blocks that are happening around the continent for Africa to really trade more with itself, invest more within the continent. When you look at our proportion of global GDP, it's only 3%, and yet we account for about 13% of the world's population. All the metrics you look at indicate that there is massive potential for Africa to really raise the level of its game and play a much more visible and felt role in the global economy.
Sanjeev.
Yeah, just if I may just comment on both Zem and also Kuseni, is that, yeah, I mean, you know, I think let's not shoot the messenger here, right? The point is that there are certain industries where beneficiation will take time, right? But I think I take your example of coffee. I mean, as a matter of fact, I was in Abidjan last week, and I was stunned to see that Ivory Coast, which produces so much cocoa, I think only gets like $2 billion of earnings a year out of their entire cocoa industry, when the entire cocoa industry is worth probably, what, $500-600 billion. So I think there is a case there. But if I may say so, and I'm probably wearing my infrastructure hat and commenting on it, that statistically we all know that intra-Africa trade is very low, it needs to improve, but I'm telling you it's not going to happen till we build some infrastructure to make it happen. Absolutely. Right? That is the single biggest obstacle, if you like, to every other well-intentioned policy and postulation that governments can keep sharing and discussing. And that is why I think one of the biggest imperatives for governments is to look at how, on a combined basis, they're going to develop infrastructure, right? I just thought I'd make that point because that's what I do for a living.
And of course, if it's going to be really impactful infrastructure, it is going to cross geopolitical boundaries, which adds another layer of complexity into the work that you're trying to do. I'm going to ask for some questions from the floor in a moment, but there's just one other quick theme I want to explore briefly. There are a huge number of Africans who live outside Africa, often having very senior roles in very sophisticated businesses. And I wonder whether the diaspora, not just in the US and the UK, but elsewhere in the world, should be doing far more, both to sell the opportunities in Africa, and of course many of them are starting to return to play their role in developing and continue the economic story. What is your perspective and take on that?
I'm glad you asked me this question, right? If we're going to transform Africa, it's on the back of obviously the talent that resides within the continent, but just as importantly, the millions of Africans that live outside of Africa. If you come to DC, in our hometown, you would feel like you've never left Africa, right? And there's lots of doctors, CEOs, guys who run the 7-Eleven. I mean, there are all kinds of things. These are the kinds of talent that could actually come because they understand how the rest of the world operates, but they also understand what Africa needs. So there needs to be a lot more done by Africans. There's been a lot of initiatives of the African Union, to be very frank, it hasn't gone very far. So near my house, there's a building, a 7-story building, a medical building, full of Ethiopian doctors in Virginia. There's probably more of them in that one building than there are doctors back home in Ethiopia. The unfairness of the migration policies for the West is they cherry pick the really talented, and then, of course, they deport the others, right? I think, well, I mean, jokingly aside, but that's what we need to do as Africans is how do we attract them? It's a responsibility of Africa, though, by the way. It's not the US or the UK which wants to keep the talented people. We as Africans have to make it easy. I'm a byproduct. I'm a returnee myself. And I've shared my experience. It's not always very easy to move back into Africa. Africans make it very difficult for these people to come back. When that talent, they can't buy it, right? Yep. But it is ready to come back. And I'll give you a very quick example and wrap up on this one. For example, in our case, there's 300 Ethiopian American doctors have recently put together, and we're raising the capital for them, $100 million world-class referral hospital. Some of them run, one of the guys actually runs a hospital, one of the largest hospital networks in the United States, and he's willing to move back. And we facilitated through this. So we can do, every year if you go to the Harvard annual conference, okay? I mean, the bandwidth that's represented in that room is unbelievable, right? But a lot of them won't end up working on Wall Street with, Goldman Sachs or McKinsey or something, as opposed to, because we haven't made it easy in Africa. So it is absolutely a priority for Africans to bring these people.
Just a quick comment. I mean, since I do come from a country which pretty much is taking everybody's job globally, I think I couldn't agree more, right? Because when India opened up in the early 90s, and I had left India by then, and then I saw the influx back, if you like, of Indian expatriates going back. I think it does three things. and in an Africa context, that's particularly critical. I think the diaspora can change the narrative on Africa. I'm sick and tired of the narrative being a narrative from the outside Africa point of view. And the diaspora can do a wonderful job in changing the narrative. Second is, of course, the skills they bring. But the third and the biggest thing that I noticed when it came to the Indian experience was when the diaspora goes back, albeit on the back of global companies that they were working for in the first place, they instill a lot of confidence in the minds of the foreign investor. Because the foreign investor or the foreign partner thinks that I've got somebody who understands me, but also understands that country. And therefore, the impact of the diaspora cannot be underestimated. I just thought I'll add that point.
Kuseni, quickly, I'm going to...
I'm pleased Sanjeev has mentioned the India case. I wanted to cite India and Israel as countries that I think are much more engaged with their diasporas. Africa's diaspora, it seems to me, is the most alienated and most marginalized resource that Africa has. Yes, we've got to look at them as a resource in terms of them coming back with the skills back home to help develop the African economies. But more importantly, even those that are not coming back, how do you use them as ambassadors to rebrand Africa, to really be champions of positive messaging around Africa? Because some of them have got so much leverage on Wall Street, in London, and in all the countries and markets where they operate. So there is massive strategic thinking that is required and action that can be executed on that front.
Right, I'm going to give an opportunity to questions from the floor. I think we've got some roving microphones. If you want to put your hand up, yes, there's a gentleman in the corner there. We'll try and get a microphone to you pretty quickly. And if you'd be kind and just say who you are and where you're from.
Thank you very much. I have this question which, I wanted Mr. Negatu and Gupta to actually clarify. And I put it this way, private sector-led economy versus the public sector-led economy, because this is the argument I have listened from both sides. And which of these theories, because I recall, when I opened up the private sector economy in Nigeria, we started recording growth of 6 to 7% per annum. And Mr. Negatu is saying that currently Ethiopia records about 10%. And there is no reason why countries like Nigeria should not record more than 10%.
Right.
But after also having listened to Mr. Gupta, the case of Ghana and Rwanda. In Ghana, it took them about 7 years to conclude or close a deal to put up the electric power project, while in Rwanda, it took them only 6 months. Now, according to them...
Sir, can you just ask a question?
Yeah,
and then because there are other people who want to get in as well.
Yeah.
So.
According to them, political leadership, consensus building within government is responsible for some of these decisions. Now, which model would you recommend for Africa then?
Thank you. And could you pass the microphone to the gentleman there? And I'm going to ask Zem to go. And of course, this is complex. So somebody said to me that the fastest growing economy today in Africa was Ghana. It's not. It's actually Libya, growing at 30-odd%. But of course, that is completely distorted by the increase in oil revenues coming. So, Zem, do you want to just tackle that?
I want to repeat what I said earlier. These are not mutually exclusive approaches. All I'm saying is the degree of emphasis, the degree of activism, and at what point is transitional. I use South Korea as an example. Today, the South Korean government is not very actively involved in running these companies. But when Samsung was created, they did, because they needed, and also they helped select champions, future champions. And that's what we need to do in Africa. I remember you when you were the vice president of Nigeria, so that was many years ago. So you're obviously very familiar. I know Nigeria relatively well because I've done a number of deals there. If Nigeria doesn't grow by 7 to 10%, we cannot expect growth in West Africa. I'm sorry. It's the engine block. that would pull. The same way that China helped Southeast Asia initially and then the rest of the world grow, Nigeria needs to grow 7 to 10%. But the way Nigeria is structured today, it hasn't grown. I mean, only when oil was at 120. So you need an activist government, but one that has capacity. The institutional capacity to deliver on the promise. The Chinese state today is very strong. It can deliver. It can order and deliver. So those things have to be there. And I worked in Rwanda, for example. We helped them develop their strategy for their airlines. I heard the same message from the president down to the office clerk.
Correct.
The message was synchronized. Yeah. Everybody was on the same page. No wonder they're top performer. That's, I think, the message I am trying to share here.
So I'm going to take two more questions. One gentleman here by the pillar and then another gentleman down here. Yep.
I'd like to follow up from Atika Abubakar's comment to Mr. Gupta about less government not necessarily being a good thing. I think the question is about the right type of government, because we heard from FW de Klerk last night that South Africa's issue is a bloated civil service. They've got low growth, and whilst the new president is seeking to get 100 billion of new investment, that cannot happen with the levels of government internally, and I think Nigeria is exactly the same case in point.
Yes, Sanjeev. Yeah.
Yeah, so firstly, you know, with the surname that I carry, I don't necessarily like to talk about South Africa. so I'll remove that from the... My apologies. It's too good not true. I think Sam's point is exactly the point, that it's not mutually exclusive. We mustn't suffer from, what is it called, the tyranny of the and or the luxury of the or whatever they call it, the phrase as it goes. The point here is very simple, that what we see lacking in the African continent largely, which is not dissimilar to other emerging environments in their stage of growth, is that government is not being able to act as the facilitator that it must be. Because government's role is either through policy or through facilitation or through regulations to create a seamless environment where private sector can thrive. Nigeria is a good example as to why private sector is not thriving. Rwanda is a good example why the public sector is thriving. The common reason is the government is acting in tandem with the private sector and removing the obstacles that allows business to thrive. And I'm just making a very sweeping statement because I don't think I have the time to break it down, but I think you understand where I'm coming from, that you cannot do business in vacuum. Government has to provide that environment.
Thank you. I also think it's extraordinary the speed with which decisions are made in Rwanda. So I was told by a mining company that an application for a mining license, either an exploration license in Rwanda, takes 6 hours, a decision from the government. You compare that to what happens in most of sub-Saharan Africa, is an extraordinary. So, of course, that is where the capital goes. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, sir, we've run out of time, but I know the panelists will be around, so if you want to ask a question to somebody specific, please seek them out over coffee. Thank you very much for being such a well-behaved audience. Could I also ask you to thank our excellent and distinguished panelists?
That was good.